Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Brilliant Labs Making a Difference speaker series. I'm your host, Alicia Collins. I work at Brilliant Labs as the Director of Creative Learning, and I'm very thrilled to have everybody. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Jennifer LaPlante from Canada's Ocean Supercluster. As a visionary in AI, Jennifer will enlighten us on the fusion of AI with our vast oceans. So let us dive in and give her a warm welcome. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm having the click problems, when that happens sometimes in life. Here we go. I'm going to share my screen with you. And I'm curious, I see there's some classrooms and some other folks joining. I was wondering, let's use our robot and tell me how you're feeling today. How are you feeling? Are you a number one? Are you angry? Are you happy? A number two? Are you kind of, tired? Number 10? It's Monday. A number 7. Okay. Anyone else? Anyone tired? Kind of blank stares. 3, 2. Oh, I got some happy. Oh, sorry. I see a 6 and a 5 and a 4 and a 4. Okay. Your class is voting 10. So that means don't fall asleep, please. All right. Well, thank you very much for telling me how you're feeling today. I think I might be a number 2. I'm kind of excited. And that's because today we're going to talk about artificial intelligence and the ocean economy. And the blue economy. And that means the ocean. And has anyone been in the ocean? Has everybody seen the ocean live in person? I'm looking to see what some of these classes say. Yes. Okay. I won't lie. I grew up in Ontario and I didn't see the ocean. I saw it when I was 6, but then again when I was 21. You swam in the ocean on the weekend. You are much tougher than I am. You see it a lot in Newfoundland. That's great. No. Okay. Well, we're going to talk about the ocean. Excellent. PEI. So we're going to talk about the ocean and we're going to talk about artificial intelligence. And we're going to start with the conversation around AI. What is artificial intelligence? And today we're in the world of narrow artificial intelligence. This means that some kinds of AI do very specific tasks. So if anyone here has maybe an iPhone or other device and they've used their face to unlock it, that phone is very specific to unlocking your face. And I know I have friends whose daughters have nieces that can unlock their daughter's phone because these are not infallible systems. They're not impenetrable. They're not perfect, but you couldn't take your phone unlocking system and have it go and identify a grapefruit from a banana because it's a very specific task that it's been designed for. Sometimes when people talk about the world of artificial and general intelligence and super intelligence, people think that that's today. So when we look at the right-hand side of the screen, this is when you can, in theory, take some kind of AI and apply it to something else. I can't take my unlocking phone capability and turn it to figuring out a banana from an apple. And then super AI is if there was the movie Terminator 2 and Skynet and it took over the world. We're not in that place and ideally we'll never get there. So there's something to be said about thinking about what is artificial intelligence and how can it be used generally. And of course, I'm going to talk about it in the ocean. But when you create some kind of AI, you need lots and lots of information and data. And so those data can be things like pictures. So I'm going to use sea stars as an example. Sometimes people call them starfish, but they're sea stars. Maybe it's a cancerous and non-cancerous cell because that sometimes gets used in healthcare. Maybe it's your spam detector. So you need lots and lots of data and you need a clear objective. So I'm going to unlock my phone. Well, I need a clear objective. I need lots of different images of people. I need to learn how to unlock the phone. So I need to identify the same person over and over. And my clear success outcome is it is the person whose phone it is, or it's not the person whose phone it is. And this is essentially how artificial intelligence works. So now I'm going to put the task on you. We're going to create an artificial intelligence that's going to identify orcas. So I'm wondering if you can tell me, what are the images of orcas? Does anybody see some orcas in this image? Is it number 1? Is it number 2? Number 5? I'm curious. There's lots of stories about orcas these days. All of them, awesome. Okay, I see plus. I might say all of them. 5, all of them, all perfect. 6, 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 1, 5. There's a lot. All of them are orcas. Absolutely. So as you're putting down your ideas, everyone's right, because what happened was there's some images here They look like an orca. And so we're saying, here we go. So number 2 does look suspicious. So we're going to go and we're going to build out an artificial intelligence on doing something. So today we're going to say, let's build out some kind of artificial intelligence that can identify orcas. The problem is maybe what we need to be doing is we're trying to protect orcas. And so we're training out a model to be able to identify what is an orca. And so as a result, we've trained a model on things that actually aren't really real. And so this machine's learned that a person in a costume is an orca, that a caricature is an orca, or that a statue is an orca. And that might not seem like a bad thing, but I sometimes would use the examples of cats and imagine I had all of these images of cats and then one of them was a lion. And my intended purpose of this artificial intelligence was to figure out what would be a really good house cat for you. Well, I don't think you want a lion living with you. Maybe you do, but I personally don't. And so comes into the concept of artificial intelligence and how we need lots and lots of data to go and train into these different types of models we're going to talk about that can help you make predictions. So that means we need lots and lots of data that's good data. And we need very clear mechanisms for us to go and label the data. So you need a clear objective. I didn't tell you what my objective was. My objective was to go and identify orcas in the water. Once you get lots and lots of data, you take a recipe, which is machine learning, and you go and you take your data and you split it up and you have some training sets and some validation sets, and you choose this recipe, which is an algorithm, and you test it to try to predict things. And so somebody would have done this when they made the same algorithm that unlocks your phone. They would have taken lots of data and they would have trained these models, and then they would have tested them. And then they would have had data sets of people who were never part of that training and put those images and those facial images in for identifying that same person over and over to unlock the phone. And that'd be the validation set, is using data your system's never seen before to see if it's accurate. And you try all of these different recipes and you try new algorithms to find the ones that work best. And I'm going to talk a little about sometimes you don't find a good recipe for everything. So one of the things I'm going to show you in a minute is around making predictions on things around weather, for example. Well, one algorithm might be really good at identifying wind in the winter, and one algorithm might be really good at identifying wind in the summer. And it's because their patterns are different. And so you can't always assume that that recipe is going to work the same. And so think my youngest son is celiac and he can't eat gluten. So I could make banana bread from the same recipe, but it's what I bring to the table that's going to make this unique recipe really interesting. And sometimes people always think artificial intelligence is this thing you can just go throw at anything. But what makes it really unique is all of the data that someone brings forward and tries a new recipe for. And so sometimes what ends up happening is you might just need a different recipe based on the data you have. And so you end up trying all of these recipes, and eventually you're going to be able to make a prediction. So you're trying to take lots and lots of data, put it in and train it and make a prediction. So here, we're going to build a model again. We've got some data. Maybe we take a neural network, which is a form of a mathematical calculation or that algorithm. And then we're making this prediction of this outcome. That looks great, looks perfect. So that is our recipe. And a lot of times people will say, oh, we're using artificial intelligence. And then people will say, it's actually statistics with a bit of machine learning. It's all kind of the same thing. You'll often hear terminology that references things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, statistics. A lot of times it can be very similar and consistent. And so sometimes people get confused because they use one word and they mean another word, or sometimes they're talking the same thing. So when you ever hear people talking about artificial intelligence, just know there is not one single universal definition. Now, here we've got a new data set. And so maybe this is images of orcas, maybe this is cancerous cells. And you've got the data that's training to make a prediction on what is considered, let's say, cancerous or non-cancerous cells. Well, the outcome that we're seeing on the right-hand side and the prediction is only identifying those dark blue ones. And this is where we have to really think about when we're using machine learning and artificial intelligence to make predictions, that you have really good diversity in your data, but you also have really good diversity in your output. And because right now, let's say this was something that's really important, like making a prediction around a hurricane and what might be the outcome of a hurricane here in Atlanta, Canada. Well, we might want to know that it's actually taken into consideration all of the factors that can feed into something that will make a hurricane really, really bad. And so we can make good predictions. Same kind of thing. If you were deciding whether or not something might be a cancerous cell based on some artificial intelligence that somebody's trained, maybe there's a reason why it's only identifying those blue ones. Maybe it's people with blonde hair and it's only doing a really good job of predicting people with blonde hair. And so then what happens with everyone else? And so sometimes when artificial intelligence systems are created, we don't actually know what data they've trained it on. And so we don't know how reliable it is. And that's why sometimes phones don't always unlock for a person, or you can have the wrong person come and use a phone and unlock it. And so some of these systems aren't completely perfect. And so we really have to make sure that when we train it, our output is reflective of the input, and that it's being trained to be able to predict and identify and make decisions around, or a very diverse set that reflects whatever was fed into it in the first place. This means whenever somebody's creating something like artificial intelligence, the data has to be really meaningful, it has to be objective and diverse. And when I mean things like objective is, let's say somebody built out some kind of model for helping HR hiring. And so maybe organizations get hundreds of resumes. And so they've built out a model that is going to help them weed through the resumes to find really good candidates. Well, who decided what's a really good candidate? Who decided to go and put things into this training set and say, good candidate, bad candidate? And so eventually when this model goes and runs, it outputs and identifies the really good candidates. Maybe they weren't diverse in their identification of those good candidates. We have to be careful about structural bias somebody might have, or inaccuracies. Maybe it ends up that certain names, people that went to certain schools, certain grades, are things that for some reason people think are not good candidates, when actually you would be a good candidate. And so we just have to ensure that as we then go and rely on these systems that we train, that they're explainable, that there might be a backup system, and that there's some kind of monitoring for it. And I'll use an example. There was a building in New York City a number of years ago that went and got rid of like key fobs and entrances. And what they decided to do was only use facial recognition to let people into their building. Well, this is kind of a neat idea, except face recognition is notoriously terrible for people who are not white. And so there's a lot of bias in the data and training sets that have gone into identifying anyone who might be of Asian descent, anyone who might be Black, and it has really struggled with identifying individuals. So now all of a sudden, if there is no redundancy or explainability for these models, or no other way for you to get into your building because it's not identifying you as a person who lives there, this is a bit of a problem. Or maybe we've decided that we've used this machine learning model to kind of save some system, and all of a sudden your Wi-Fi goes down or your internet goes down and there's no power. How do you get around these systems? And so sometimes we go and create these really neat AI that is cool and can help make things more efficient, but as a result, we can't really explain what happens. So we have to make sure that if the system fails, that there's still a backup, that anybody who could be vulnerable isn't put in harm's way, and that it doesn't cause harm. There's also been increasing work that's been done around things like in court cases, when somebody is going in front of a judge and they're trying to decide what somebody's sentence might be. And there's been absolute bias in historical decisions around what kind of sentence someone gets. And so if you were to go and try to create some kind of machine learning model that decides what kind of sentence someone should get after some kind of trial, well, all of a sudden that harm is being caused to someone else because you're taking some information off the past that might not be just for that person. So these are some of the things that we get into. This is not blue economy, but this is AI. And this is why it's super important to understand how artificial intelligence is created. And here's an example of a really good book I highly recommend lots of people read, called The Big Nine by Amy Webb. It talks about the 9 big companies in the world that are creating artificial intelligence. OpenAI, who makes ChatGPT, is actually now on the scene, so it makes it kind of 10. But there's all of these companies, they call it G Mafia and Bot. And G Mafia are the companies that tend to be based more in the United States. Bot, which is Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, that are based in China. And there's some pieces here that I think is super important. There's this brief window right now where these are the people who are developing all of the artificial intelligence tools that are going to be used by the vast majority of us. Every email you send, every text message you send, every photo you send, it's getting stored somewhere, and it's getting stored within one of those companies' servers and systems. Every message you send via Snapchat, every WhatsApp message, every Instagram post, every direct message, these companies are able to see it and build a profile around you and the information you share. And so it's really thinking about what data you arm these companies with. They create really, really awesome tools and great algorithms and models and recipes we talked about. But then, of course, that means they also have lots of control over different things. But the big problem we see, I've got to carry over on my text here, is the diversity in these organizations. And so here I am advocating and saying, you know what, if you're going to go and you're going to create some kind of AI solution today or in the future, make sure you really think about what harm can get created. But what happens if the population of the workers in a lot of these organizations isn't really reflective of the population in general? All of a sudden, who's going to ask those questions internally? Who's going to say, but what harm can be done with our systems if we're not careful? And here's some stats, for example. Google's workforce, only 4.1% is Black. In Microsoft, it's only 5.1%. Gender, only 26% of tech professionals in general are women to start with. So you really have a limit of diversity, which means when somebody's stopping and thinking, are these reels that kind of have stereotypes and keep pushing out the same kind of info to people over and over, and TikTok algorithms that are pushing out content harmful to people? And if you don't have their employees asking those questions and trying to put preventative controls in place, then maybe they're not necessarily safe. This gets into the whole idea of who's making decisions around training models. If you were to have a car that drives autonomously, this dude's just playing a game in his car. This is a TV show called Upload on Prime. It's a screenshot of it. And he's taking me to the airport as fast as possible. The problem is who's making the decision around whose life is most important. If this system is driving autonomously, what happens if it runs into a small child or who's running across the street? If it's prioritizing who's in the car, it might not care. Or if there's about to be a collision and it's going to swerve, maybe it's not going to swerve in the right way. And so all of the systems that we rely on for artificial intelligence get created by someone, and we have to really understand what their decisions were. And then the other thing you have to think about is a risk to creators. So this is an old version of when DALL-E, which is OpenAI, ChatGPT, first came out. I asked it to make me a group of 7 excellent, hopefully it's art you covered at one point during your education, group of 7 style paintings. And so this went and created these paintings for me in the group of 7 based on the prompts that I provided here. Now we start thinking about how is AI a risk to other people. So we have to be really careful to think about the different types of systems you create and what harm it can cause to others that we didn't really intend. Nevertheless, a machine needs to learn from someone and something, and it needs to learn from data. And when I'm talking blue economy, we're talking about the ocean economy in Canada and around the world and why it's so valuable. And we're going to talk about why the ocean's important. And so right now, more than 80% of the goods that you touch are all shipped across the ocean. Everything from the clothes you wear, cars you might drive, bananas you might eat, all sorts of things. They come across the ocean. They come in vessels and ships. And that's how you get those goods. 70% of the oxygen you breathe comes from the ocean. Every other breath you take is coming from plankton that's in the ocean, from different algae and different things that produce oxygen. 3 billion people in the world get their protein from the ocean. And maybe you're not a lover of fish, or maybe you are, but we have to remember that lots of people rely on the ocean for their protein. As climate change happens, as our waters warm, they become more acidic. As the Arctic ice melts, all of a sudden we're seeing migration of species moving further and further north, which means that these species aren't necessarily in the location where they used to be, where people relied on them for consumption. It also means that some of the species can't handle the changing climate. And so all of a sudden, if the water is getting warmer and more acidic, they're dying off. And it also means now we're changing the biodiversity of what's in the water, because if you relied on one kind of species for you to survive and that species had to migrate elsewhere and you didn't migrate, you're not going to survive. So we really have to ensure this overall ecosystem is sustainable. And then the last piece is the ocean absorbs 50% of the carbon that we emit. And so it is extremely, extremely important that we don't mess with that we continue to let it absorb all of the carbon that's being emitted. We don't want to emit a lot of carbon. Trust me, we're trying to reduce that, but we still need to rely on the ocean to help us. And so I work for the Ocean Supercluster, and this is a member-led organization where we work with companies from across Canada to really grow the ocean economy in Canada. And here's the 4 areas that we're really focused on in the next 5 years. Ocean energy. We know that we can produce massive amounts of energy leveraging the ocean in renewable ways. This includes wave buoys, so collecting energy based on movement within the wave. Underwater, which is tidal, so it's underwater as the tides move and the water flows, it can generate energy. And then wind, it could be fixed, it could be offshore floating, but we have lots of opportunity to leverage and take advantage of the wind out there. And this is a renewable form of energy. Another one is sustainable seafood, where I talk about people need to get food from the ocean. This is really important to us. Future transportation, more goods that we move across the ocean, super important, because it means maybe there's not a truck on the road driving and it's sitting on a vessel. It's cost efficient, but it can still be very harmful when we think about the fossil fuels that are used when you move transport across the ocean in vessels. One thing that's really important here too is Apple recently changed their approach, and what they've said is they're migrating off of moving things as just-in-time inventory when they're manufacturing things. They currently fly things. And so they're now moving to try to move them by vessel because it's less greenhouse gas emissions. But that also now means there's this increased use of more vessels on the water. And so that's really great in the sense that we're going to see fewer airplanes flying, which is less greenhouse gas emissions and less carbon. On the flip side, it could mean more vessels, which mean more strikes against whales, which can mean more traffic, which can mean impacts to habitats that don't really love the noise from vessels. And so there's always these changing things that we're trying to ensure things are sustainable. And then the last one is around overall climate solutions. What are really important to us? Maybe our habitat. So we live on coastal locations, which means erosion is really important. Storm surges are huge for us as well. We're looking to migrate off of fossil fuels. So somebody who's a fishing vessel might be looking for an alternative that has a bit of a battery or dual fuel consumption opportunities for vessels. So different types of solutions that can help us address our climate. And one of the things that's really important to us is how artificial intelligence can help us get at some of these things. So here's a really neat example. I'm going to go through a few of them so you get a chance to see the diversity of the ways people are using artificial intelligence in the ocean, and then also the different types of data that you can collect. This is an organization or a company called Cyan, and what they did was they collected lots of species of kelp. And so it's different biodurate substrate species of kelp, essentially like seaweed. And what someone did was they collected lots and lots of data, hours and hours and hours of footage, where they have a plumb line. So they're always the same distance away from the kelp, and they just swim over top of it with a camera. And when they take one of the partners in the company has a PhD in this area, and so went through and labeled all of the types of kelp. And this is really valuable because as organizations or countries or different groups are trying to understand the biodiversity underwater, they're able to see over time the evolution of the types of kelp that are surviving, the biomass estimation, which is how much kelp there actually is. They're also able to assess the health of it. And so this is kind of like the same kind of algorithm or recipe to use to unlock your phone. You can do something kind of similar where you're identifying different species of kelp. Another one is shipping. So we get into the 80% of goods that ship across the ocean. Well, there's shipping logs that come in, and there's lots and lots of data that comes in talking about what comes into Canada, how much of it, who sent it. All of these records are not perfect. And so there's companies that work on cleaning and processing this data. So just the same as if you use Grammarly that fixes your spelling mistakes or your sentiment, or maybe there's predictions now that we're seeing more in all of our emails that are happening. That's called natural language processing. They do the same thing on shipping logs. And so cleaning and processing that data can make things a lot faster and easier for shipping companies, for Canadian border services to know what's coming in, and for customs. And it's just an example of other types of machine learning models and AI that can be used to advance the ocean sector. Natural language processing also gets used in things like records management. So let's say you had a fleet of vessels and you could start doing preventative maintenance because you start taking different types of records that you know about when things were fixed, when something went wrong, how many miles, nautical miles you have on a vessel, and other types of behavior. And you can start using the text that comes off of some of your records management to make predictions around when you need to service these vessels to fix things before they break. This is one around shipping. So this is and ports. And the bottom right is an example of a buoy. And so buoys collect data around wind speeds, wave heights, and other types of information. And this is really valuable because before a vessel pulls up and pulls into a port, any port in the world, they need to know the wind speeds and wave height. And the reason why they need to know this is because if the wave heights are too big, when they hit a big crest and the wave goes up and then bottoms down, if there's not enough clearance there, the vessel could actually hit the bottom of the ocean, and that's not a good thing. Another thing that's really important is when it's really windy and really wavy, it's really hard for a pilot captain to climb up the side of a vessel. It becomes unsafe. And so they use the information that comes off of a buoy to make these predictions or to make these decisions about whether or not it's safe enough conditions. Well, what happens if that buoy is not available? And this gets into the whole idea of redundancy, always having some kind of backup or business continuity that you can allow for this to happen. This is an example of using time series data. And sometimes machine learning and AI, people think of these really complex neural networks. Sometimes it's simply a regression. And I'm pretty sure regressions are covered in grade 10 or grade 11 math. So using regressions to make these time series predictions can help you identify that value. So you're predicting what the wind speed's going to be, what the wave height's going to be based on historical information. But this is where you get into those things around bias. What if I only actually had summer data and all of a sudden I wanted to predict winter data? Well, I don't have any winter data to make that really good prediction. So my model is going to be flawed. And so this is the whole idea of thinking that you need to have lots of really good, robust data for many years before you can make predictions. So if I only had 2 years of storms, for example, or during hurricane season here in Halifax, I might not have enough data to make a really good prediction because hurricanes aren't that often. And when they come, they're not exactly consistent. And so sometimes you need lots and lots of data for you to make really, really, really good predictions. And it's not just one single event that you can use history of. You need to have many of those events to make history of. This is an example of a neural network solution. And in the Bay of Fundy, we have the highest tides in the world. So those of you who haven't had a chance to ever see the Bay of Fundy, what a sight where those tides completely go up and down. Well, there's a lot of work being done around tidal energy in the Bay of Fundy. And this organization was using an echo sounder to collect data around what's happening in the ocean. And so they take an echo sounder and drag it behind a boat for 24 hours and collect a bunch of data. And what it does is it sends a ping down to the bottom of the water and then comes back up. And what they're really interested in is finding fish in the water column. They want to know how many fish there is. But the other piece you run into is things can get really noisy on the surface because you get lots of waves. And fish have air in their bubbles and waves have air. And so you want to be able to cut out data that is not valuable so you can count the fish. Well, what happens is it's a very manual process. And so this might be a 5-minute interval that we're looking at. And some person would have to sit and draw a line to cut out what is considered bad data. So what we did was we worked with them on creating the neural network that would automate this process. It would draw the line that the human would have drawn. And it's not completely perfect. It still needs a bit of review in certain spots. As you can see, though, for the most part, the lines are pretty consistent. And so when we think about how AI can be really helpful in the ocean sector, taking a job that could be really boring, very tedious, open to human interpretation. So maybe I were to come in today and draw a line, and then my colleague came in the next day and drew a line, and maybe we draw them completely different. If you have lots of history of things that have been done in the past, you can merge it all together. You could end up having some really good consistency and ideally make probably a job a lot more enjoyable for the person who likes to come in and look at discrepancies versus actually go and draw the line for everything. This is another example of computer vision, kind of like unlocking your cell phone. And this is with mussels. And so mussels and oysters are incredible species. I'm pretty sure it's an oyster that can clean like a bathtub of water a day, and it filters them out. And so these are great species at understanding what's happening in the environment. And so this is based in Dartmouth at Cove, the Center for Ocean Ventures. And this company, Integrity, is set up and has underwater cameras looking at images of mussels. They're sitting there on popsicle sticks, hanging out and living the good life. And what happens is they open and close. Well, what they're trying to find is what these mussels can predict before any other system. These mussels are very sensitive to the environment around them. So can we use species like this to identify toxins in the water before other sensors might find them? And there's lots of great ways for us to take advantage of the species that are there, and setting up a system like this with an underwater camera that makes a prediction and identifies when something happens or lets us know when these activities are happening. So instead of having a human sit and watch, we could train a model to go and say, okay, 5 of the 9 oysters are currently open and then they closed. There's something going on. Let's go back and look at other data and see how water toxicity might have changed. And another version of kind of like a computer vision, but not quite. This is a neural network that's using sonar data and video data. And this is one that uses data that's around hydro dams. And so hydro dams are a great source of renewable energy, but sometimes fish make their way up the wrong way, which means we kind of have a threat to those species of fish, and it's unsafe for them to be traveling through. We don't want to shut down hydro dams unnecessarily, though, because if we have a great way for us to make renewable energy, let's continue to do it. And in the past, what's happened is people sit and manually watch for fish, which is extremely tedious and boring. And so instead, this company, Innovasea, was working with Nova Scotia Power, and they were building out this way to predict and identify species of fish. And one thing that's really important to know is it's different types of machine learning models and artificial intelligence that identify species. So there's a difference between me telling you something's there, telling you how many are there, and telling you what kind is there. And it's fascinating sometimes in having conversations with people around artificial intelligence, because sometimes they think what happens is you just create one artificial intelligence solution, off it goes. But you very much need very specific objectives and outcomes, kind of like I'm going to unlock my phone. You need to know, I want to know how many fish. I want to know what kind of fish. And then eventually you can merge those things together. But often you're not training for one specific thing. Again, we go back to why the ocean matters. These are super important pieces. And I think as you're ever interested in looking to learn more about the ocean, I highly recommend having a look at some of the work that we've done at the Ocean Supercluster. There's the Ocean Startup Project that also talks about different companies that have started out building businesses out of the world of the ocean. And there's a lot of really great career opportunities for you to explore. I saw somebody said that they were in Newfoundland, which means MUN has great programs there. Dalhousie has great programs and lots of other programs around the world around ocean science, and awesome career paths for anyone. So we're gonna, once again, I'm gonna blame Google Slides because I toss these in Google Slides. In terms of like AI, remember, this is taking human intelligence and reapplying it. So I gave examples of where it's gone and made predictions around, is this a fish? Is this not a fish? Is this drawing a line of whatever? You're taking information and data that somebody has already specifically said, is this, not this? And so that means it's mimicking humans. So it's actually not an artificial intelligence, it's copying people. We're still in that world of narrow AI where it's doing one specific thing. Deep learning is essentially, it's a computer that is learning without being programmed. So we're kind of training this machine to do things, but you're still convincing it and telling it things based on humans. And AI is really good at repeatable tasks. So things like looking for fish over hours and hours of footage, that's a human can't easily do that, but it's a clear, consistent task, and it can do it quite well. AI is really good because it can reduce risk. It can increase accuracy. You can redeploy resources. So if I have a skilled person that's doing one thing, I can make them go somewhere else and do other things that aren't as valuable and get them to go and work on the important stuff. It's really good to relieve people from really boring, mundane tasks as well. And also sometimes when people are thinking about upgrading or replacing systems, it's a really good way to do it. I'm going to go and I'm going to build out some kind of AI solution. But the other thing we have to remember too is it can monitor systems, and it can really prevent us wasting money on things we don't know. Remember when and when not to use it. Definitely use AI when you can expedite. So if we want to think about optimizing vessels that move across the ocean, it's great, but maybe you don't want it to drive the vessel autonomously when it's a massive container ship. You want to know how that AI was created. So can someone be harmed? So that orca, maybe if I trained an orca model to identify orcas, I'm not really hurting someone, but if there's a chance that it's an HR hiring for somebody who might go work with orcas and has never worked with orcas, maybe that's how we should actually train our systems. And then the other thing I think is most important on that last one is who's accountable for that outcome. So somebody goes and makes an AI solution and they deploy it and they start using it for predictions, but then who's actually responsible for what happens with those systems? You could go and be buying a solution from one of those big 9 companies, and then who's actually accountable for it? So AI is a really great tool, and it's really great in the ocean. We just have to make sure we're conscious of what we're doing with it. And I wonder if anybody has any questions about any of the stuff that I just shared.
This is super fascinating. While we are waiting, I have a question. I love the way that you focused a lot on the ethics around AI at the beginning of your talk. And we have a lot of young people joining in and are kind of going through this phase where, you know, like you said, program or be programs is like using AI or being used by AI. So what is your advice to encourage them to kind of avoid these biases? Like as they grow up, like how can they contribute to make this better?
Great question. One is get rid of things like TikTok. Don't have those systems on your phone. Number one. I think you're the product. You're the one who is giving data to companies. So being very conscious about what you share and who you share it with and how. And when you get into the role where you're responsible for some of these decisions, ask how it's made. So maybe you're using a system to help you in your job, Ask who made it and trained it. OpenAI, ChatGPT is something people use quite regularly. Did you know that if you go and anything you upload into ChatGPT, they own now? And so let's say you were like, I'm going to put my family photos up there and I'm going to ask you to create some ChatGPT-4, or GPT-4 is like really cool and can do multimodal things with text and images. And so maybe you're like, I wanted to go and do something with this, but that now means those companies own whatever you just gave them. And do you want them to have images of you and your family? So sometimes you just should be thinking about who created it. Are they creating good things? Is it fair to other people? Are people being marginalized? I'm very much an anti-Meta Facebook organization person. I don't think it's a good company, Instagram. And they take a lot of information from people and they cause a lot of harm because they false feed information that's not correct to people. They let people learn things that aren't true. And so I think it's stepping back and thinking, do I want to support these companies with the behavior and the technology I use? And so I think it's just making informed consent decisions. Good question. What other options do we have? I mean, it's all relative. It depends on what people need from a social media standpoint. Okay, gauging the health of the ocean and plankton within the Bay of Fundy. Is it easier shallow waters? How do you deal with silt and fine? That's an excellent question. So, okay, here you go. You want to look, the questions around how do you gauge the health of the ocean? And you're using, is it easier to do in shallow water versus other places where you might have silt and other particles? As long as you have lots of diverse data for all of those specific situations, and they're trained appropriately for those situations, and they're labeled by the right people who know what they're doing, it should be able to work. It might not be as good in places where you have a lot of silt, for example, but if you get enough versions of it with diversity and training it, there should be possibilities to, in theory, be able to create it. But what happens sometimes is people will go and take images only of shallow water and then try to apply it to deep water, but it's not the same. So it's the same kind of thing if I were to look at like corrosion underwater on a pipe or on something, right? If I took that image in the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and I took it in the summer and the winter, and I took it with different versions of sand underneath and some rocky, and the pipe had different kinds of corrosion, and it was really diverse and it was well labeled, I probably could take that and apply it to other places and it would work pretty well all the time. But if you only took one location based on one time in one spot, that's not really transferable. So you just want to have lots and lots of data that goes in and feeds it to ensure that the training model has seen every possible scenario. What are the biggest hurdles in the continued development of AI? I think access to data. So in the ocean side of things, because that's where I am right now specifically, I'm going to go with what happens is, okay, let's say I'm a company and I have a lot of really interesting data. It might be useful to somebody else because maybe they're making something that's big and robust. They want to find more orcas. They might not know I have the data. I might not know they could use it, and we'll never come together. And so one of the challenges you have is just the robustness of data and being able to share it with other people and help them kind of see it. So data is a big hurdle. And then I think the other thing is just awareness of how AI can be used. It can be used for a lot of really interesting things. Sometimes people just don't know what the opportunities are. And so you don't always know the problems you're trying to solve and the data you have. The two worlds don't always come together. There's this gap that happens. And so I might know, okay, we want to get plastics out of the ocean, but I might not know a company that has so much data around plastic migration, and we could build some really good predictions around how to stop it. But because the two of us don't know, we want to solve have a similar issue that we don't know, we could bring the worlds together. Can AI be used for anticipating piracy like in rough? Absolutely. Okay, so piracy, here's an example of where AI is being used. It can and it can't. So there's some really interesting work that's been done around AIS, which is the tracking on vessels. And so vessels is kind of like a location tracker, and vessels turn that on because they don't want to hit each other and they want people to know where they are. But if I'm doing something bad, I'm not going to have my AIS on. I'm going to turn it off. And so there's challenges in places where there's piracy because pirates would not, like they can see your tracking. They know there's a vessel coming. So there's different work that's being done around leveraging satellite images and overlaying it with the AIS tracking and then being able to identify the gap. So when you see a picture of a satellite image of a vessel, I think every 12 minutes might be around how much you can get for clarity is how often it goes back around. You can and then identify the vessel. And so there's increased work that's being happened with a lot of different NGOs on trying and with shipping companies to try to make it safer for them based on identifying some of that satellite activity. So you can also identify there's a vessel there you can't see with AIS. A question around overfishing with data sets and limiting how much. Okay, there's two pieces. One that's really interesting is I worked with, there's a student who did a master's at Dalhousie a couple of years ago that worked on something like this on overfishing, and there's two pieces. One is the overfishing around jurisdictions around the world where there's fishing rules. People will have, your AIS should in theory identify you as potentially a fishing vessel versus a non-fishing. And it's not exactly how it works, but you normally have categories. Well, what you can do is you can train a model that uses a neural net that says, this is the common behavior of a fishing vessel. Well, then you overlay it on non-fishing vessels. And isn't it funny how these vessels kind of have a similar pattern to fishing vessels? And so even though they're not supposed to be. So there is work that's being done in other jurisdictions around the world where this is really, really prevalent to try to identify those vessels. To say, okay, this vessel keeps doing this. They're not supposed to be fishing, but they're awfully acting like an awful lot like a fishing vessel. So that's overfishing in one sense. In terms of overfishing for some other things, in BC, this is really common. It's called electronic monitoring. And what they do is they have people, well, they do it all around Canada, but they have people that will randomly go onto the fishing vessels and watch how much they're catching, doing audits to determine if they've actually caught the right amount of fish that they say they have versus on quota, that they're not catching species they shouldn't be. And so what they've gone and they've installed cameras on vessels and they're collecting data. And then what happens is if at one point there's a bit of an issue within the audit, they'll go back and review the footage and then see if those fishing vessels have been doing things they shouldn't be, catching fish they shouldn't be, different types of activity. So there's a couple of companies who've been working on using computer vision to go through and do this, where they're actually identifying the species of the fish and then counting them. And those cameras are on there, they're required, they're capturing 24/7. So this is now making it a lot faster and quicker to review all of this footage, which means it's going to change regulations, which will then allow for having more and more of this kind of monitoring in place. Because before, you could have a fishing vessel catch data on every vessel all the time, but it would never be humanly possible to review all of it. So what's the point? Now, if you're at the point where where systems and technology and compute power and models, algorithms, and recipes are at the point where you can actually go and better screen and identify that activity, then it makes it reasonable. It makes sense that we have regulatory requirements for us to continue to collect that much data. And then we could track and identify, are we overfishing? Are people catching species they shouldn't be? Different kinds of activity. In terms of limiting how much we take, that's a whole other problem too, because we don't always know how much is down there. And so technology around the data, like the one thing that we've seen in advancements with, batteries last longer. We can store more data than ever before. Our sensors are getting so much better underwater. Our cameras are getting better, which means now we should be able to collect more and more data around what is underwater. It's not perfect. We're never going to have a full understanding of every single stock of every fish. All the practices that have been employed for many years are going to continue on. But over time, we should have a better understanding based on the data methods we're able to collect more information around fish, which might help us understand more around overfishing in general. So actually, how much was there of a stock in the first place, and understanding the quotas we have established to see if we can keep our ratios at the right spot. Any other questions? Oh, sorry.
We have a couple of more minutes. I have just one question as a follow-up. You mentioned about that AI needs to learn from humans. And then as you're discussing these predictions based on that the data has been fed, but you also mentioned like the risk involved and like kind of having a backup in case something goes wrong. And prediction is kind of like a tricky thing just in general. It can also negatively impact a lot of these decisions being made. So is there like certain ethical account in place for to avoid like making these decisions solely based on these predictions, like within the ocean sector?
So ocean sector or not, there are no laws in Canada today that govern the use of AI. So there's Bill C-27, which is currently in its has finished its second readings and it's headed into its third in House. And so this is also replacing a couple of other laws that we have in Canada around AI. I don't believe it's as strong as it could be in terms of rules. Essentially, the goal of what we have to have is that we're not governing what AI is, we're governing how it's used. And so understanding the inherent risk associated with it is the most important thing. So in the ocean sector, are there things that could be done where somebody goes and makes an AI that is not good for people? Absolutely, it can happen. This is where I think as consumers, we should ask how was this created? How are you using these systems? People who are buying it should be asking those questions as well. But I think we also have to associate it with risk. Is somebody at massive risk of some harm? Or, you know, does it mean that maybe I'm going to do something the wrong way and maybe it's not optimal? Like, I think there's a balance here of understanding human risk, environmental risk, financial risk. But if it's you taking on the financial accountability and you're the one who's harmed for your bad decision, then that's you. But if it's hurting humanity, it's hurting people, a group of people, a marginalized group of people, then that's a real problem. And so unfortunately, there are no rules in place. So I think it really does come down to the questions around decision makers and how they're deciding what technology to use.
That's something to ponder upon. But this has been such an enlightening talk. Like, there's so many things I'm still thinking like I didn't know, and you explained it so beautifully. And we are all like being curious and thinking more about this thing. So thank you so much for inspiring us, for maintaining our curiosity. On behalf of entire Brilliant Labs and all the audience members who are joining, I really want to thank you and show our gratitude to you.
Thank you very much. And I hope that people learn some more about the ocean and how you were a 7-nighter too. Thank you. That makes me really happy. I hope that you learn more about what the ocean sector means to Canada and how it really diversifies us as a country. And I think we're real leaders in the ocean, and we will continue to be.
Thank you. And I'm going to stop the recording, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Well, thanks for that.
Yeah, I'm going to send you the chat too. And we do a survey at the end. So I'll ensure to share all the amazing